Tonight, let's step into the world of Roman kids, where turning 13 wasn't about getting pimples, but officially being considered an adult, and where fashion didn't involve streetwear, but just a few layers of cloth, along with a confident attitude that could silence the entire arena. If you're curious to know how chaotic, humorous, or terrifying being a teenager in Rome really was, stay right where you are, because tonight's story will have details that might make you rethink your own teenage years. And before we begin this time traveling journey, if you enjoy unique historical perspectives and stories told in ways you've never seen before, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps me get more motivation to bring you even better videos. Don't forget to comment and tell me which country you're watching from and what time it is right now. Knowing that we're connecting from all over the world is truly amazing. If a Roman teenager's morning was a noisy, chaotic warm up, the rest of the day was an adventure you never signed up for. But Rome waits for no one. It doesn't ask your opinion, it simply drags you into its flow. Fast, loud, and always with two or three people arguing right behind you. Stepping out of the house, you immediately face something every Roman teenager had to accept. You don't belong to this world. Yet this world expects you to act as if you were 3 decades older. You just learned how to tie your shoes properly, and suddenly they expect you to know which politicians are lying more cleverly. But that's Rome. If you live here, you need to run before you learn to walk. For Roman boys, the first stop after breakfast was school. A place not exactly a school, but enough to make you want to fake a cold just to skip a day. Your classroom was often an open courtyard where your teacher, a man both wise and easily irritated, tried to teach while the cries of fish sellers, wine vendors, and gossip sellers were louder than your lesson. You sat on hard wooden benches, copying Greek sayings you didn't yet understand, while the sun deliberately shone straight into your eyes as if it wanted to join the test. Rome believed a teenager should argue like a professional politician. So you learned rhetoric, not to win debates with classmates, but to survive in a city where even a baker could convince you that their burnt loaf was artistically golden brown. You practiced speaking, standing, and gesturing without hitting the person next to you. Everything was judged, everything was scrutinized, and you knew that mispronouncing a single Latin word could make your family the talk of the town for a whole week. And Roman girls? Their day went in a completely different direction. No noisy school, no rhetoric lessons in the market. Instead, they were guided at home by their mother, aunt, or elder women in the family. But don't mistake that for an easier life. At 13, while all you wanted was to go out and look at the streets, your mother placed a skein of wool in front of you and said, "You must spin it beautifully. The reputation of the whole family rests in your hands." Besides learning weaving, embroidery, and managing food supplies, Roman girls had to master an extremely important skill: maintaining the family's dignity. That meant walking gracefully, speaking politely, and, most importantly, staying away from neighborhood drama. This was nearly impossible because Rome was the center of gossip, scrutiny, and stories blown up 3 times bigger after just one afternoon. One wrong glance, a moment standing too long by the window, and you became the main topic for the neighbor ladies. Whether male or female, a Roman teenager's life was full of duties. After lessons came helping with household work. If you were a boy in a carpenter's family, you carried wood, sawed timber, and occasionally got scolded by your father for sawing crookedly. If you were a merchant's daughter, you counted money, kept ledgers, and learned to negotiate without losing out. Rome didn't believe in the concept of a rebellious age. Here, everyone was already rebellious. You were not allowed. After school, you continued your journey through the city. Sometimes your father took you to the Forum, the political heart of Rome, where chaos was professionally organized. A magistrate was declaring something important, while nearby a vendor tried to shout louder than him to sell a few more figs. You saw senators in white togas walking with solemn dignity, and at that moment, you realized you'd spend your whole life learning not to trip while wearing that ridiculous cloth. If you were a girl, your parents sometimes took you to the temple to perform rituals. You learned how to pray, offer sacrifices, and observe other women, to know what to do, what never to do, and what would make people gossip about you for 3 months. But whoever you were, you could not escape a quintessentially Roman activity: manual labor. This could be carrying water, sweeping the yard, helping your mother prepare food, or going to the workshop with your father. Rome saw labor as a moral quality, and you knew that if you complained, some uncle would tell you, "Back in my day, I worked since I was carried in arms." Yes, Romans loved exaggeration. Finally, when the afternoon waned, you experienced Rome in a way only teenagers could understand. The city suddenly grew quieter, but not peaceful. It was like a lion resting after roaring all day. Still powerful, still dangerous, just full. You returned home, dusty from head to toe, tired but filled with stories to tell. Because although Rome was difficult, loud, and chaotic, it was a city where every moment was vivid, real, and never boring. Teenage life here didn't pave the way for you. It threw you into the battlefield and expected you to find your own way out. But that was what made you Roman. When you and your friends roam across Rome, the city becomes a living maze that no map could ever fully explain. Twisting alleys, uneven stone steps, the cries of vendors mixed with the creak of horse-drawn carts all form the soundtrack of your teenage years. And the most exciting part? No one controls you too tightly. Romans believed that children should learn by real experience. They didn't know that your experience sometimes included racing your friends through crowded markets, dodging people carrying ceramic jars bigger than your future, and challenging each other to see who dared touch a statue of Jupiter before the guards noticed. You and your friends played games that adults would surely call pointless, but they were the most valuable childhood memories. One day, you tested your balance on slippery paving stones. Another day, you sneaked in to watch a street magician perform, then laughed hysterically when you discovered the magic was just a piece of cloth hidden up the sleeve. But the most important thing was this: Rome made you feel like you belonged. Not as a child, not fully as an adult, but as part of the city's ever-changing rhythm, where anything could happen around the next corner. And then there were the festivals. If everyday life was chaotic enough, Roman festivals were an upgraded version, where the whole city seemed to temporarily forget responsibilities and revel to the fullest. For teenagers, a festival was a place where freedom was turned up to the maximum. You could merge with the crowd, watch processions of gods pass by, smell incense mingled with street food, and marvel at acrobats on stilts taller than the city gates. One of the festivals you looked forward to the most was Saturnalia, the only time of the year when all social rules were reversed. Slaves could sit at the table before their masters. Children received gifts. Adults had a little too much fun. And you, a Roman teenager, felt for the first time that the world could be upside down without anyone complaining. You and your friends ran around, throwing chestnuts at each other, laughing until your stomach hurt, and felt Rome as a companion rather than a city demanding productivity every minute. But Rome wasn't only about festivals. There were quieter afternoons when you and your friends climbed a high step at the temple, looked down on the city, and talked about the future. You spoke of dreams, fears, and hopes that even adults didn't know you had. These conversations, without teachers, without parents, without the hammer of a blacksmith, became a place where you understood yourself better. But that future was not always easy to swallow. Roman society placed heavy expectations on your shoulders. If you were a boy, you were reminded of your duties to family, the state, and honor. If you were a girl, you were expected to become the silent pillar of another household, responsible for managing everything but rarely receiving recognition. That pressure crept into your life like a chiton that was both tight and long, one you were forced to wear. Yet Roman teenage life was not entirely bound by duty. There were still small but precious pockets of freedom. Did you like telling jokes? You became the center of your group every evening. Could you sing? You practiced with your neighbor boy, hoping one day to perform at a grand ceremony. Loved sports? You and your friends spent the entire afternoon on the training ground, racing, jumping, throwing stones, shouting in ways adults deemed excessively loud. But which adult hasn't been loud themselves? Perhaps the most compelling part of being a Roman teenager was the constant need to adapt. Every few months, you faced a new challenge: learning to write on a new wax tablet, helping your family prepare a big feast, practicing how to speak with dignity. And sometimes it felt like you were being trained to become the perfect version that adults expected. But what adults didn't understand was that you weren't just learning skills, you were learning to find yourself amidst the chaos. Late at night, when all work was done, you sat in front of your house, listening to Rome slowly drift to sleep. Children were asleep. Adults spoke softly. Vendors packed up their stalls. Oil lamps flickered on the walls. And you felt what the Romans called the anima urbis, the soul of the city. You realized that you were not just a teenager in a harsh society. You were part of Rome, and Rome was part of you. Even if life was tiring, even if the future was demanding, even if you had to grow up sooner than desired, you still found joy. Joy in the laughter of friends, in running through the streets, in lessons you actually understood, in the fleeting, proud smile from your mother. Ancient Rome never let you just be a child, but it gave you the chance to prove you were stronger than you thought. And it was in those chaotic yet brilliant teenage years that you began to realize who you would become in this vast world. When you step into a Roman festival, the first thing you feel is not the music, not the aroma of food, but the sensation that the entire city is bouncing in a strange way. Nothing excites a Roman teenager more than knowing that for the next few days, all the adults will temporarily lose control, and you are allowed to let go of all expectations. Cobbled streets are hung with flowers, shops are decorated with ribbons, and laughter rings out as if the gods themselves are joining the party. Whether you are a wealthy teen in a neat tunic or a craftsman's child sneaking a few coins in your belt, the festival makes everyone equal in a way that even the Senate must helplessly accept. For a teenager, it is not just a time for fun, it is a doorway to temporarily escape the pressures of the city. During these days, you can meet friends without fearing being sent back to chores, eat sweets without your mother asking where's the money from, and shout loudly without being considered rude. Everyone, from running children to aunties carrying baskets of fruit, merges into the same excitement. For Roman teenagers, a festival is like unlocking life energy that has been bottled up all year. You do not just observe the chaos, you become part of it. And that chaos spreads to the point where even the games get out of control. In the street corners are groups of performers who enjoy over the top acts. Young orators compete to deliver speeches, though no one listens. And teenage boys are so absorbed in games of chance that they imagine they could challenge the goddess Fortuna herself. It is in these moments that you and your friends can encounter one of the greatest delights of Roman teenage life: audacity. You are ready to cheer for a stranger, wrestling, chase a street band because they promised an encore, or jump into a crowd just to see if you can catch a flower thrown from the stage. But the festival is not only about fun, it is also a time to feel the spreading power of the Roman community. As the sun sets and oil lamps are lit, families gather together, vendors display hot dishes, and you realize that Rome, though noisy, chaotic, and sometimes frightening, is strangely vibrant. Being a teenager in this context is like being swept into a current you never want to leave. After the festival, life returns to its usual rhythm, but for the young, nothing is truly normal. You still have to go to school, or at least pretend to. Roman schooling was not a place for gentle discussions on philosophy or history. It was a battlefield between teacher and student. The rhetoric teacher would lecture endlessly about morality, honor, logical thinking, and the necessity of becoming a serious person. Of course, all of this would be completely meaningless if anyone in class dropped something or accidentally made a silly sound. Roman teenagers were easily distracted, prone to laughter, and not shy about teasing each other, so classes often ended with the teacher sighing in exasperation. Philosophy, literature, and rhetoric lessons had a strange allure, partly because Roman philosophers loved telling quirky stories about Greek kings or eccentric thinkers, partly because you could show off newly learned knowledge to friends as if holding a doctorate. And although sometimes you found these lessons dry, during free afternoons when you and friends debated what was right or analyzed whether an athlete deserved honor, you realized that the lessons had actually sunk in without you noticing. But no school teaches you to understand Rome better than Rome itself. The city is a giant classroom with every street corner offering its own lesson. You learn to weave through crowds without stepping on toes. You learn to read vendors' expressions to know if they are genuine or about to trick you. You learn to judge the sound of a distant horse cart and dodge in time. And you learn to hold your wallet tightly because while Rome is the center of civilization, it is also the center of lightning fast hands. More importantly, it teaches lessons about people. Rome was built on strong character, and the older you grow, the more you understand that strength does not come only from muscles or fame. It comes from connection, from knowing who supports you, from friendship, a treasure more valuable than all the money in the richest citizen's purse. Your friends are the ones ready to run with you from a chasing dog, share half a loaf of bread when you have no coins, and laugh at you when you stumble over your own cloak. This city can make you fall, panic, swear you will always wear sturdy shoes, but Rome also gives you memories to carry for life. You learn to live amid chaos, adapt to the unpredictable, and find laughter even on the worst days. Rome is not just a home, it is a lesson in growing up faster than you think. And that is why, for a Roman teenager, every day is an adventure. Not because of grand events, but because you never know what will happen next. Will today bring an eccentric philosopher, a passionate street singer, or a horse drawn chase down the main road? No one knows, but you are always ready. Because Rome, noisy, crazy, full of strange smells and humanity, is the perfect world to learn how to become yourself in a way that no historical record could ever fully capture. If you think Roman teenage love was merely a few shy glances and awkward confessions, you would be surprised. Because in a city where family honor mattered more than the weather, and where everyone was ready to record every event as if they were amateur journalists, romantic love became a strategic game. You had to be careful as if steering a chariot down a steep hill because a single misstep could have the entire neighborhood gossiping for weeks. But that never stopped the kids. When hearts rebel, all rules become suggestions. Usually, it all started from a chance meeting at the market, in the bathhouse, during a religious ceremony, or even on the way home after buying a few honey cakes. A glance exchanged, a smile barely restrained, and you found yourself caught in the emotion that ancient poets always swore could paralyze the human mind. It did not help that your friends always exaggerated everything to the point that you began to believe the gods were truly meddling in your love life. And once you liked someone, the next part was a series of awkward but determined actions. Boys tried to appear stronger, smarter, more mature, sometimes all three at once, resulting in what looked like a comedic performance. They stood near the one they liked, but not too close, talked about serious topics, though no one really listened, or adjusted their cloak to look nice, only to accidentally step on it. Yet the intention remained precious. In their eyes, if that person paid even the slightest attention to them, it was a victory for the whole kingdom. Girls, on the other hand, handled the situation with a finesse that would impress any god of love. They knew social limits, how to maintain propriety without losing the subtle language of emotion. A glance held half a second longer than usual, a slight tilted smile, or the way they stood in someone's line of sight appearing accidental. All of it was art. These small moments were the love messages of Rome, only missing the romantic soundtrack. But teenage love was not all romantic. It came with the fear of parental discovery. In Rome, liking someone was not always considered a personal matter. Your family saw it as part of a long-term plan for honor and prestige. This made every romantic encounter feel like an adventure. It was hard to talk to the one you liked when you always had to watch for someone from your family or neighborhood passing by, because even a single witness could spread rumors faster than a green horse chariot team. Interestingly, sometimes those very limits made the feelings even more intense. When you are young and forbidden, everything becomes heightened. A small smile could keep you awake at night. A casual word could make your heart pound like festival drums, and the thrill of exchanging secret glances could make any Shakespearean tragedy seem tame. Roman teenagers also had best friends, companions who encouraged you, sometimes accidentally ruined everything, and offered advice they thought was wise, often quoting a poet, philosopher, or something overheard at the market. But the result of that advice was often you standing a few steps away from your crush, saying something so philosophical that even you didn't understand what you were saying. But that is teenage life. Mistakes are part of the game. Then came the festivals, where the distance between two people could shrink in just a few moments. Lights, music, the warmth of the crowd, the smell of sweets, and the electrifying atmosphere made hearts softer than ever. If lucky, you might walk beside the one you liked for a while, share a honey cake, or laugh together at a street performer's silly act. For many teenagers, those simple moments became memories they carried for a lifetime. But what made teenage love in Rome most memorable was the fact that it never stood still. Sometimes it ended as quickly as it began, a misunderstanding, a cold glance, or an irresponsible rumor. Teenagers could be heartbroken, complain to friends, swear they would never love again, and a few days later fall for someone else carrying a basket of grapes at the market. Teenage love in any era has always been an emotional comedy. Yet there were also beautiful stories, quiet romances that grew over time, where two people matured together, shared festivals, public baths, rhetoric lessons, small city adventures. Whether they ultimately ended up together or not, they still remembered that first fluttering sensation as a magic that never repeated. Therefore, teenage love in Rome was not just awkward flirting or secret meetings. It was part of growing up, a lesson in emotion, courage, mistakes, and sometimes honor. In a vast city where everything happened faster than you could process, love was what made you feel truly alive. It made the world more vibrant, the cold stone streets feel warm, and the noise of Rome become the soundtrack for emotions you never knew you had. And even after thousands of years, the most wonderful thing is those heart flutters, those thrills, those silly moments are still no different from now. Growing up in ancient Rome, you did not merely age, you were molded, not by quiet moments, but by the relentless noise of a city that considered privacy a luxury comparable to Greek diamonds. Teenage years in Rome were not for those seeking to find themselves. In reality, the city found you before you could find yourself, and it had a plan for every breath you took. Rome was a place where a harmless conversation could turn into a national rumor in just one afternoon. If you let slip that you had feelings for someone, within hours, the housewives on Aventine Hill were debating whether that love would benefit your family's status. Children ran around guessing the name, merchants analyzed whether the future marriage would be financially advantageous, and stray dogs, in true Roman fashion, barked as if they too wanted to join the discussion. Rome had no social media, but it had a gossip network so fast and efficient that Mark Zuckerberg would probably shiver if he knew. Yet, amid all the expectations, pressures, and ever watchful eyes, Roman youth persisted with resilience and pride. Roman children knew life was not designed to be gentle with them, but they still dreamed, still felt, still loved, and held on to hope. A strange and daring hope, almost a silent rebellion against a city that always wanted to turn them into adults as quickly as possible. For boys, the moment of crossing into adulthood was not an emotional or cognitive shift. It was a public event, a performance, a declaration. Your father would pull you through the forum, where all the powerful men gathered, or at least those who liked to think they had power, and introduce you as if you were a newly launched product. You had to stand there, smile, hold up the toga slipping from your shoulder, while every figure 3 or 4 ranks above you offered advice as if you were already married, had 3 children, and were preparing to campaign to become a judge. And whether you liked it or not, you had to appear to understand that advice. Because in Rome, confusion was not an emotion. It was as weakness. The city expected you to mature in that very moment. Not tomorrow, not after reflection, but right there. Besides senators preaching morality while challenging you to comprehend their financial policies. That was how Rome taught you to become a man, by throwing you into a sea of duty and hoping you knew how to swim. For girls, coming of age was not a threshold, it was a transfer of power. You did not merely become a woman, you became the pillar of a household. From supervising young servants to coordinating religious rituals, you had to know everything before anyone taught you. You were the mediator in minor family disputes, the budget planner, the one ensuring meals were fully prepared, and the household's diplomatic ambassador. And when married, you became the bridge between two families, where a small misstep in speech or behavior could be seen as a political insult. With all that oversight, you learned to handle every situation with the calm expression only Roman women perfected, a gentle smile coupled with calculated charm. Not because you were fake, but because Rome demanded that ability as a survival skill. And then, over the centuries, as Europe entered the Middle Ages, a strange thing happened. People decided that love, instead of being a political danger, should be elevated into a mental sport. From afar, where Rome had once ruled, the cold castles of Europe created a romantic system so absurd it became courtly love. This was not love for marriage. This was love for suffering, love for sacrifice, love for never touching each other. And oddly, it was considered the highest expression of the heart. Knights entered this game not to conquer, but to yearn. They worshipped a woman they could not have, speaking of her in poems that even Apollo himself might find slightly embarrassing. The woman, real in life but entirely fictional in poetry, became a symbol of all that was good. She was intellect, moral strength, a guiding light for the man, whether she was busy measuring seeds or chasing chickens from the granary or not. Poets of that time did not care. They did not write about the woman tending the fire because the house was burning. They wrote about their goddess, whose eyes could change the course of stars and whose voice could halt wars, at least on paper. And here lies what connects two seemingly unrelated worlds: Roman teenage years and medieval courtly love. Both reveal a simple but powerful historical truth. When society imposes thousands of laws, expectations, and duties on the young, they will always find a way to survive through imagination, through desire, through emotions that no system can fully control. In Rome, it was the first flutterings whispered across the forum. In medieval Europe, it was poems so long they could replace books of scripture. But in both places, youth resisted pressure in the only way it knew, with an unconquerable heart. In that context, noble marriages in the Middle Ages resembled diplomatic agreements more than matters of the heart. They were contracts sealed with family crests, land strategies, and political obligations, where emotions were merely secondary, if not outright forbidden. A young couple might meet for the first time at their wedding, standing in the church, awkwardly gazing at each other like two strangers summoned into a ritual they themselves did not fully understand. No one expected romance in marriage, so the absence of it bothered no one. Yet it was precisely this emotional void that created fertile ground for courtly love. The whirlwind of spiritual desire, noble suffering, and vows never to be fulfilled, to flourish almost instinctively. The repressed emotion could not appear within their own home, where family duties took precedence over everything. Therefore, it had to flow outward, through the song of a troubadour, the glance of a knight, or a courteous gesture of a lady at a banquet. And as these melodies spread, courtly love gradually became an outlet for the soul, a mental game refined to such subtlety that only those of status had the time and leisure to play it. But the interesting thing was, not everyone played the same way. For ladies, courtly love was the subtlest social weapon. Praise from a troubadour could elevate their prestige as if it were a military victory. An admiring glance could become a bargaining tool in a world where women were often excluded from official power. A lady who had multiple knights worshiping her discreetly and according to proper decorum would be regarded as possessing high virtue and a soul that inspired others to improve themselves. It sounded harmless, but it was enough to change their social standing, to make their husbands wary, and to turn them into the center of an intricate political network. Their honor became the most valuable commodity. A gesture too intimate could shatter their reputation. Conversely, subtle restraint could make them symbols of virtue. They had to balance on the thin line between allure and vulnerability, between power and surveillance, and that balance created the charm of courtly love. Meanwhile, a knight was bound not only by armor and honor, but also by an ideal sculpted by the troubadours themselves, the suffering yet proud man, fighting for ideals and serving a woman he could never touch. It sounded unrealistic, and it was, yet it was the perfect tool to create brilliance in poetry and legend. Knights did not actually live in poems. They had to oversee budgets, manage lands, collect taxes from peasants, and sometimes become embroiled in generational family disputes. But within the framework of courtly love, they were allowed to become characters in another story. a hero who knew suffering for love, who knew passion, who was absolutely loyal to an ideal no one could criticize because it never crossed the line into action. Pain became a reward. Losing a battle was not failure, but proof that their hearts were still fighting. And then, as these songs echoed through the castles, the allure of that distant love spread to lands the troubadours themselves had not anticipated. It was not only the southern nobility who were enamored. When princesses from Provence or Aquitaine entered northern courts, they brought with them the culture of that spiritual longing, and the cold courts of England, Germany, or the Low Countries suddenly seemed more poetic simply because a lady entered with a handkerchief inflated by a ballad. Of course, this dissemination was not random. Scribes, minstrels, and nobles who appreciated refinement acted as the influencers of the Middle Ages. They recounted the stories of courtly love, not only because they were captivating, but because they carried a new conception of human value, that emotions, even repressed, deserved respect, that spiritual desire could be stronger than duty, and that the beauty of a fleeting moment could sometimes matter more than an emotionless married life. But the spread of courtly love did not merely reflect human longing, it mirrored the social structure itself. When marriage was an obligation and women were limited in official power, a mental space was needed to satisfy what real life did not allow. Courtly love filled that void with intense yet safe emotion, a torment that never erupted into scandal unless a troubadour wrote too boldly. It was the legitimation of desire, a stage where everyone could play the role they wished while still maintaining their real life duties. And so it endured, spanning centuries, crossing borders, becoming a cultural reference point lasting to this day. Romantic tragedies, unattainable loves, characters torn between duty and emotion, all are the spiritual legacy of courtly love. A system that began as a pastime of the nobility became a model for Western literature, music, and art for hundreds of years. Courtly love was not real love. It never was. It was the collective dream of an era, the idealization of desire, a mental play everyone knew was unreal but still wanted to believe in, because sometimes it is precisely the unattainable that makes one feel truly alive. To understand why courtly love exploded as a wave of emotion in the Middle Ages, you have to imagine a world where everything, from whether two families nodded in agreement to each other, could shake an entire kingdom. Marriage at that time was like an investment strategy: who allied with whom, who exchanged lands with who gained tax routes and inheritance rights. In such a dry environment, where personal feelings were ranked below the number of war horses in the stables, it was natural for people to seek an outlet to breathe. And courtly love, with all its daring and mystique, was the safety valve that society had inadvertently created. The medieval nobility lived in cold castles, but were surrounded by thousands of expectations. Sons had to become warriors. Daughters had to become instruments of peace treaties. No one was allowed to be romantic in the modern sense. If you like each other, then marry, because that was considered a political disaster waiting to happen. So when a system appeared in the court that allowed people to feel something, to be moved, to write poetry, to idealize another without being hanged in the square, everyone clung to it as a lifeline. And so, in the cold stone halls where flickering candlelight reflected on armor, romantic stories were suddenly legitimized, but only according to the rules. A knight could openly worship a lady as long as he spoke beautiful words, acted beautifully, and did not go too far. Courtly love was expected to be pure, more spiritual than physical, a form of love through imagination. But let's be honest, humans have never been good at keeping everything pure, especially when they spent years away from home, full of adrenaline, frustration, and strong drink. It is no surprise that poems, ballads, and romantic festivals quickly pushed the whole system to a fragile edge. Young knights, many only 17 or 18, were thrown into a world where honor, desire, and governance were intertwined like tangled knots. They were obliged to protect the honor of the woman they swore loyalty to, and that alone was enough for violence to erupt from the smallest misunderstandings. A gaze that lasted too long, a ribbon blown by the wind at the wrong moment, or a poet writing slightly too much about a lady's braid, any of these could turn into disaster. But it was precisely this fragility that made courtly love irresistibly seductive. It was like walking a tightrope, thrilling, dangerous, yet intoxicating. The prohibition made it stronger, more poetic, and it became part of noble culture that no one dared openly admit, but no one dared abandon either. Ladies were not passive either. In a society where they had little choice, courtly love was a stage where they could exercise soft power. With just a glance, a ribbon, or sometimes even a compliment about courage, they could send knights into competitions, debates, or even conflicts with each other. This was both dangerous and enchanting, giving them a voice that feudal society often denied them. Interestingly, even though the church tried to intervene through condemnation, preaching, and spiritual warnings, this system persisted for centuries. Why? Because it fulfilled a deeply human need to feel important, to be seen, to be desired. Even in a vast castle full of gold and power, nothing was more luxurious than the feeling of being the center of a poem. It cannot be denied that courtly love, despite being labeled pure, produced unforeseen chaos. Scandals, court disputes, and fiery duels in the name of honor occurred. Many kingdoms wavered not because of war, but because hearts were far too passionate. Famous love courts, presided over by powerful ladies, also demonstrated how seriously medieval society this system. They judged questions such as, can a woman love two men at the same time? Or should a knight write poetry for the lady to whom he swore loyalty? Questions that might seem childish actually reflected deep conflicts in the system, between duty and desire, between rules and instinct. Courtly love did not just shape personal relationships, it influenced politics. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine used emotion and romantic reputation as levers of power, shaking Europe. Knights famous for their poetry and sentiment sometimes wielded greater influence than seasoned generals. Wandering poets, heard by both nobles and servants, became transmitters of culture, ideas, and even gossip. And amid all this chaos, one thing ensured the system endured. It made feudal life, full of duties, debts, wars, politics, more colorful. It gave people the feeling of truly living, even if only within the safe confines of verse. Courtly love was not a substitute for marriage, it was a substitute for repressed emotion. It was a parallel world where people were allowed to dream, to long, to desire, but never touch reality. A dangerous, beautiful, and paradoxical game, yet one that helped shape European culture. In the stifling darkness of Victorian drawing rooms, where the air smelled of lavender perfume and strict expectations, it was believed that a woman's mind was a problem that medicine had to fix. At the same time, another obsession spread across Europe, gentler but no less dangerous, the suppression of emotional desire. And when these two worlds collided, on one side a society obsessed with morality, on the other hearts longing to feel, chaos was born. If courtly love in the Middle Ages had been a gentle rebellion against duty, the Victorian era transformed that very emotion into a threat that needed to be controlled. This century, in many ways, was where the heart and medicine clashed most fiercely. The truth was, emotions were never considered harmless. In the Middle Ages, loving the wrong person could ruin your reputation. But in Victorian times, loving the wrong person, or worse, loving too intensely, could become a medical diagnosis. Love was no longer merely the driving force of poetry or courtly tragedy. It was confined in medical journals and became evidence that women were fragile, excitable creatures who needed to be managed. Love was the language of the heart, but the Victorians decided to turn it into a symptom. And when you look at the medical records of this century, you see something both laughable and frightening. Almost every emotional expression was considered abnormal. A young woman writing an overly passionate love letter, a sign of nervous overstimulation. A wife enduring an unhappy marriage, mild psychological collapse. A widow claiming she missed her deceased husband, symptom of female depression. They truly believed that every strong emotion of a woman had to originate from within her body, as if the heart and uterus secretly conspired to disrupt social order. But the truth was, these women were not weak. They were simply feeling life very humanly, something that society at the time did not know how to handle. Look a little closer into the recent past. Before Victorian medicine medicalized every emotion, medieval poets understood that desire was what made people profound. They described the pain of love as an honorable wound, a state of mind almost sacred. They did not try to cure it, they celebrated it. Courtly love existed because humans wanted to feel something stronger than duty. But when the Victorian era inherited these emotions, it tried to suffocate them with all kinds of pseudo-scientific theories. The irony was, the Victorian era was also a time of great advancements: telegraphy, dentistry, anatomy, chemistry. Yet at the same time, society believed that a woman's sorrow was proof that her body was malfunctioning. Instead of looking at obvious causes like arranged marriages, stifling moral expectations, or lack of freedom, doctors blamed women's biology. That was how authority worked. When a problem was too large or inconvenient to solve, the label was slapped on the most vulnerable subject. And so the forbidden love stories of the Middle Ages, once celebrated as symbols of desire and freedom, became distorted versions in the 19th century. If a Victorian lady fell in love outside marriage, it was no longer considered a romantic tragedy. It was emotional disorder caused by an overactive uterus. Some conservative thinkers even wrote that women who loved too passionately could harm the family structure, an accusation that sounded more like they were talking about termites eating walls than humans. Yet the astonishing thing was, despite all attempts at control, women still loved, still desired, still felt. And these suppressed emotions created an undercurrent in Victorian culture, visible in novels, diaries, letters. When you read the works of the Brontes or secret love letters of the period, you feel the vibrating tension between heart and moral chains. It was precisely this tension that became the soul of the century, a society believing morality was a shield against chaos, yet forgetting that humans were born to feel, not to be categorized. Perhaps that is why the obsession of this century with women's mental health became one of the clearest mirrors reflecting society's fears: fear of change, fear of desire, fear of independence. Every misdiagnosis was not just a personal wound. It was a declaration that society believed it was so fragile that a single woman stepping outside the mold could unravel order. But history has proven otherwise. It was precisely those women deemed unstable, those who felt too much, dreamed too big, or loved too intensely, who paved the way for the changes Victorian society feared most. And ironically but beautifully, those misdiagnoses, those prohibitions, inadvertently created women who were stronger, more resolute, and more persistent. Looking back at both eras, the dramatic courtly love of the Middle Ages and the controlling medicine of Victoria, we see a strange but consistent truth. Society always tries to manage what it does not understand. But the heart, in its own way, always finds a path to escape through poetry, through desire, through the very mistakes history tries to bury. Finally, one thing never changes. The desire to love, to be free, and to be oneself is always stronger than any diagnosis. And history, in a very human way, has always sided with those who dare to feel. In the darkness of quiet rooms where curtains blocked the sunlight and the air was stifling like a permanent obsession, Victorian doctors transformed hysteria into a sophisticated and powerful weapon. It was not merely a medical diagnosis, but a declaration of control over women. They could define emotions, thoughts, desires, and even the most secret longings. This was not just science, it was power, cloaked in morality and legitimacy. Every note in a medical journal could become an order. Every diagnosis could become a shield to imprison a person. Hysteria was a unique creation, vast and vague enough to encompass nearly every expression of a woman, from fatigue, anxiety, sadness, to sexual desire or the yearning for independence. All became signs of an unsettled body. It could appear in any woman: the wife caring for her family, the young girl coming of age, the widow, or the middle-class woman working outside the home. Even behaviors that seemed normal, such as reading, writing, or independent thinking, could become evidence of an imaginary illness, sufficient to justify the remedial measures of Victorian medicine. The true power of hysteria lay in its pseudo-scientific appearance. Doctors borrowed theories from ancient Greece, believing that the uterus could wander throughout the body, causing emotional disturbances. While this idea had once been laughed at in ancient texts, in the 19th century it was presented with absolute seriousness. The Victorian world, obsessed with order, silence, and femininity, found in these theories a justification for their power. Women were not only weak, but also a potential danger if left uncontrolled. And who would control them? The doctors, armed with medical and moral authority, were responsible for judgment. Then treatment methods appeared, medical in form but totalitarian in essence. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's rest cure became a symbol of this refined cruelty. Patients had to remain bedridden for weeks, sometimes months, forbidden from moving, reading, writing, or engaging in any mental activity that might stimulate emotion. Even walking around the room was considered suspicious behavior. Time passed as an endless spiral of solitude, boredom, and despair. The body recovered, but the soul gradually withered, and women's silent suffering was crushed under the guise of medical care. Everyday actions such as crying, anger, or refusing food were recorded as evidence of illness, not natural reactions to confinement. Each expression reinforced the notion that women had to be controlled, that desire, yearning, and independence were threats. Even creativity, like writing or poetry, was seen as dangerous, and any idea of mental autonomy became a reason for sedatives, cold baths, or electrotherapy. These methods did not cure, they extinguished the voice and presence of women. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, with her famous story The Yellow Wallpaper, is a vivid testament to this cruelty. Gilman herself underwent Mitchell's therapy, forbidden to write, and nearly completely collapsed. In the story, a woman gradually loses her mind as she is isolated, forced to deny all pleasures and creative longings. This descent was not entirely fictional. It reflected the horrific reality of quiet rooms, where women confined not only lost freedom, but were stripped of their humanity. Each passing day eroded their identity, piece by piece. In the asylum, their existence was no longer life, but evidence to validate diagnosis and societal authority. But the cruelty of Victorian medicine was not limited to isolation. Drugs became the ultimate tool of control. Opium, laudanum, chloral hydrate, ether, all were prescribed to numb emotions and desires, transforming women into near soulless entities, fully compliant with societal norms. These substances were not meant to alleviate real suffering. They were chemical locks, drowning longing, extinguishing will, and bleaching emotion. The more a woman exhibited rebellion or desire, the higher the dose, the more the control system was reinforced. Oddly, similar behavior in men was rarely considered pathological, reflecting a social standard sometimes harsh to the point of irony. And if women dared to challenge the order, seek knowledge, or demand physical autonomy, they were labeled with all manner of diagnoses: moral insanity, hysteria, nymphomania, or manic depressive. Once the diagnosis was recorded, no further proof was necessary. Medical authority became a cage where women were trapped within their own emotions and bodies. Even basic acts like crying, walking, or normal reactions to mental anguish became evidence, making escape from the asylum nearly impossible. Asylums became repositories of morality. Women became embodiments of every social fear, desire, longing, independence. And the most terrifying aspect was that the system operated with legitimacy, with scientific light illuminating every act, making their suffering both cared for and erased. Behind locked doors, countless women disappeared into diagnoses that did not reflect their minds, but mirrored society's fears of change, rebellion, and women's latent power. And within that silence, that paralysis, hearts that once longed for freedom and love still quietly dreamed of a world where they could be themselves. In the darkness of Victorian medicine, drugs were not tools of healing, but tools of control, where the paralysis of the body equaled the paralysis of the will. Sedatives, from mixtures of alcohol and opium to chloral hydrate, became means to turn women into semi-conscious, powerless entities, helpless before their own lives. Each prescribed dose acted as a subtle warning. If emotions flared too intensely, if desire or stubbornness exceeded social norms, extinguish it. They were not allowed to resist, not allowed to participate in any aspect of natural life. Their pain, frustration, or desires became evidence of nervous instability that needed to be suppressed. Even joy and creativity, qualities that nourish the spirit, were deemed dangerous and had to be restrained. Sedatives were promoted as scientific treatment, but in reality, they taught women obedience. Dependence on medication made them quiet, passive, and pliable, fitting the ideal Victorian feminine model. Pills administered by injection, ingestion, or massage to balance the nerves effectively transformed women into puppets, detached from themselves, from their emotions, from their desires. One dose, one induced sleep, and even emotional pain was erased, replaced by a semi-conscious state where all resistance was meaningless. In society's eyes, women were considered healed, but in reality, they were erased from control over their bodies and minds. Sexual desire, a natural instinct, became a manifestation of moral instability. Victorian medicine did not recognize that women had the right to sexual autonomy. Instead, it treated these desires as dangerous threats capable of collapsing society and morality. A woman longing for intimacy or feeling dissatisfied in marriage was not experiencing normal emotions but was a patient in need of medical intervention. Nymphomania became an overarching diagnosis, encompassing genuine desires as well as the slightest curiosity or normal feelings. Every gesture of affection, every sexual daydream could be listed as a dangerous symptom, justifying treatments such as isolation, cold baths, electrotherapy, or clitoridectomy as scientifically sanctioned measures. The horror lay not only in the methods, but also in the society that accepted them. Doctors, endowed with prestige and knowledge, became arbiters of moral and mental worth, determining who was abnormal, who needed treatment, and whose autonomy should be restricted. In the asylum, silence was medicine, and paralysis was the goal. Women were confined in dark rooms, deprived of all stimulation, their diets controlled, forced into absolute rest, with no alternative but submission. The body was cared for, but the spirit was torn apart, piece by piece. Those who resisted most fiercely only proved their instability, further justifying their confinement. Ignorance of the female body amplified the danger of this system. Doctors rarely studied female anatomy or physiology seriously, viewing women as weak, emotionally and morally unstable versions of men. Genuine conditions such as postpartum depression, endometriosis, chronic pain, or polycystic ovary syndrome were rarely correctly diagnosed. Instead, women were labeled exaggerating or weak. When they reported pain, doctors interpreted it as a moral failure rather than a physiological or psychological signal requiring care. Even tuberculosis, a deadly epidemic, was romanticized by Victorian medicine. Pale skin and gaunt bodies were celebrated as symbols of feminine beauty, while real suffering became adornment for society to admire. Women were praised for fragility, yet blamed for weakness in death. Even medical research reflected bias. Treatments were based on male physiology. Women were seen as weak, unpredictable variants, and their pain was scientifically trusted or studied. Thus, Victorian medicine both invented imaginary illnesses and refused to acknowledge real ones. Silence, submission, and dependence were praised as ideal qualities, while women's voices, desires, and will to live were erased. The ghost of hysteria did not vanish with the era. It morphed into subtler prejudices permeating culture, social norms, and sometimes influencing how we perceive women's health and emotions today. Echoes of fear and control remain. Postpartum depression was officially recognized over a century after being misunderstood. Chronic pain and autoimmune disorders are still often diagnosed late, and the notion that women are overly emotional or excessively reactive persists, recalling a time when their silence was bought with pain, medication, and isolation. Victorian times created a system where power and morality dominated women's bodies and minds. Every room, every pill, every sedative dose was part of a sophisticated control structure. And though modern medicine has advanced, its traces still quietly shape how we view women's emotions, desires, and autonomy. Understanding this history is not merely a study of medicine or culture. It is a way to reassess values, recognize latent biases, and learn not to repeat the injustices women endured for centuries. Under the bright sunlight of the Mieza Hills, Alexander began to realize that true power did not come solely from muscles or a sword, but from intellect and the ability to understand people. Aristotle was not just a professor, but an architect for a young mind, someone who created frameworks for Alexander to envision the world, anticipate events, and recognize motivations that even seasoned generals struggled to grasp. Each lesson in biology, logic, astronomy, or politics became a building block in the construction of the prince's mind and strategy. But the most profound lesson Aristotle taught was not academic knowledge, but a perspective on power. That leadership was not merely about oppression, but the art of persuasion, combining understanding of people, strategy, and ethics. From these hours of study, Alexander began to develop meticulous observational skills. When dissecting fish with classmates, observing insects, or recording every movement of nature, He was not only learning science, but learning to see things as a whole, a discipline that would later help him manage a vast empire. Lessons in stern strategy did not only take place on imagined battlefields, they existed in relationships between students, in physical challenges, and in the way Aristotle analyzed every action, every choice. From studying Achilles, Alexander did not merely admire the hero, but learned to identify human strengths, weaknesses, and pride to apply in practical strategy. But it was not just theoretical knowledge. Misa was also a place to train the spirit. Wrestling matches among the boys were not merely games, but lessons in discipline, determination, and endurance of pain, qualities Aristotle always emphasized as necessary for someone who would lead armies and an empire. In these training hours, Alexander learned to control anger, face challenges without panic, and find joy in conquering both himself and his surroundings. Friendship and rivalry among the boys were owned like blades, helping Alexander develop the ability to read people, predict behavior, and understand the motives of adversaries, skills that could not be bought with gold or swords. Alexander also learned to combine theory and practice. When Aristotle guided the students in observing the stars or explaining biological principles, he emphasized that knowledge was truly valuable only when applicable. The world was not merely books, it was a complex puzzle to be solved with intellect, observation, and decisiveness. Alexander embraced this with undiminished enthusiasm, for from childhood he had been driven by big questions. Why do people fight? Why do empires collapse? And how to create what has never been seen? Aristotle did not just provide answers, but taught him how to ask questions, a skill that would later become instinct for the greatest conqueror in history. During free hours, Alexander observed his fellow students and learned from them. Hephaestion, his most loyal friend, taught him about loyalty and empathy. Cassander taught him about ambition and calculation. Lysimachus taught about physical strength and strategy. Seleucus taught patience and discipline. Each individual was a piece of the complex puzzle of humanity, and Alexander learned to utilize each piece for his larger goals. Aristotle did not force him to become a single model. Instead, he revealed principles, allowing Alexander to explore, experiment, and apply them. Lessons from Homer and Achilles also shaped Alexander's philosophy of leadership. From a young age, he saw Achilles not merely as a hero, but as a symbol of courage, pride, and human limitations. Aristotle taught that courage must be paired with intellect, pride must be balanced by understanding, and every victory must have political and ethical meaning. Alexander learned that conquering a kingdom was not only about overpowering an army, but also about understanding the psychology of the people, persuading allies, and building trust, an art he would master across the world. Lessons at Mieza also taught Alexander the importance of preparation and foresight. When Aristotle pointed out principles of war, governance, and ethics, Alexander began envisioning future campaigns, step by step, considering choices and potential mistakes. He learned not to act on impulse, yet to maintain the flame of passion. The combination of intellect and ambition, theory and practice, observation and creativity laid a solid foundation for the young conqueror's future. The space of Misa, with its quiet forests, outdoor study tables, training fields, and shaded groves, became a living experiment in leadership and intellect. Alexander learned to balance ambition with ethics, strength with wisdom, competition with friendship. These experiences not only shaped strategy and character, but also nurtured a deep belief that the world was a maze to be conquered through intellect, courage, and careful observation. When leaving Misa, Alexander was not merely a prince educated according to royal standards. He was a young strategist, a philosopher in practice, and a keen observer. He carried knowledge, experience, and a vision of how people, empires, and power functioned. From that point, ambition was no longer a vague feeling but a reasoned plan, a fire of enthusiasm honed by knowledge and observation. Mieza did not just teach Alexander to learn for the sake of knowing, but to learn to act, to understand, and to become a leader who would guide the world in his own way. When Alexander stepped out of the hills of Misa, he was no longer the boy who observed, learned, and dreamed. All the lessons in intellect, discipline, endurance, strategy, and mythology had fused into an inner rhythm, a rhythm both subtle and extraordinary. Aristotle had planted in his mind the awareness that knowledge was the most powerful weapon, and that understanding people, society, and nature was the key to unlocking every door. Philip, meanwhile, taught him that physical strength, perseverance, and endurance were the foundations for turning theory into action. Olympia whispered in Alexander's mind, kindling a mystical flame, reminding him that his destiny was not accidental, but predetermined, written by heroes and gods. The combination of intellect, physicality, and belief created a man half myth, half real, a warrior ready to conquer the world. Each morning in Macedonia began before dawn. While mist still lingered over the fields, Alexander trained with his comrades in horseback riding, sarissa javelin throwing, and battle formation drills. These were not graceful rehearsals, but grueling trials where endurance mattered more than raw strength. The hills were not just terrain, but tests of will. Each time a horse reared, each time a spear struck the ground, Alexander learned to control himself, analyze the situation, and turn fear into action. He learned not only to defeat external opponents, but to conquer himself. Every bruise, every pang of pain was a testament to steadfastness and great ambition. But Macedonia did not only teach Alexander about combat. Long marches and military inspections under Philip's guidance provided him with a broad strategic vision. Alexander observed veterans, formations, and the rhythm of each unit, learning to coordinate discipline with flexibility. He realized that an army is strong not only when soldiers are skilled, but when they trust their leader and each other. Philip deliberately exposed Alexander to the realities of war, the consequences of battles, the wounded, and the dead. These experiences did not instill fear, they strengthened his resolve. Alexander understood that victory was valuable, but the cost to achieve it must also be fully comprehended. He learned to balance courage with caution, ambition with responsibility, and strength with ethics. While his body was honed in Macedonia, Alexander's mind always turned to Homer and the stories of mythology. Riding through the hills, he imagined colossal battles where Macedonian cavalry charged against distant empires. He imagined himself as Achilles fighting at Troy, but Aristotle had taught him not only to dream, but to analyze. Each victory, each tactic, and each decision had to be weighed carefully. Mythology was not merely inspiration, it was a blueprint for strategy and ethics, a framework for constructing a vision of leadership. Alexander also learned to manage emotions and wield influence. He quickly realized that personal charisma could be a tool of power. From adolescence, those around him were drawn to his decisiveness, courage, and keen observation. Aristotle encouraged debate, questioning, analysis, and earning respect through reason, not merely authority. Philip emphasized presence and action, that a leader must lead from the front, not merely observe from afar. Olympia reminded Alexander that legend and myth could inspire, but could not replace real effort. These three voices coexisted in Alexander's mind, weaving into an inner symphony: power, knowledge, and belief. Alexander did not just learn theoretical leadership, he learned to understand people in practice. When accompanying Philip to military councils, he observed how generals debated, analyzed maps, considered logistics, and strategized. At first, he listened, but soon offered bold opinions, anticipated opponents' moves, and suggested creative solutions. Philip was both surprised and pleased, quietly realizing that his son was not merely learning, but beginning to surpass all expectations. These experiences taught Alexander an important lesson. Leadership is not just issuing orders, it is the ability to influence, inspire, and earn loyalty through practical action and trust. Yet strength and strategy were insufficient without knowing how to turn fear into a weapon. Philip deliberately allowed Alexander to witness the consequences of war, from minor skirmishes to loss of life and property. Rather than intimidating the boy, these experiences awakened in Alexander an awareness. Victory always comes with sacrifice. He learned to observe, assess risks, and prepare for harsh circumstances. Fear was not extinguished. It was controlled, directed, and weaponized. This created not only a clever warrior, but a leader who understood the value of life, death, and the responsibility of power. The combination of mythology, knowledge, physical training, and practical warfare forged an extraordinary Alexander, ready to enter the world Philip and Aristotle had prepared, yet in his own way. He was not merely a Macedonian prince. He was the archetype of the conqueror, the leader, and the one who would turn legendary dreams into reality. Every drill, Every debate, every physical exercise was a step along the path he would follow, a path leading to the greatest empire of the ancient world, where knowledge, strength, and belief merged into an unstoppable force. Alexander emerged from adolescence not as a boy, but as a forming legend, carrying three legacies: faith in mythology, the training of body and mind, and a strategic vision beyond imagination. All had prepared him not only to conquer territories, but to conquer hearts, and ultimately to carve his name into eternal history. As Alexander entered adulthood, the light of his youth had not yet faded, but the shadow of reality had fallen over every step. Misa, the hills where he had trained, were now only memories, and Alexander had to step into the real world, where decisions were no longer games but matters of survival. His greatness was no longer just potential or imagination. It had become responsibility, challenge, and the first battlefield was Macedonia, where each day held threats from the court, from northern tribes, and even from his own allies. The combination of intellect, strength, and belief in destiny now had to be proven through concrete action. Every move Alexander made in the court was a political chess game. He had to read not only words, glances, and gestures, but also anticipate actions that had yet to occur. Half-brothers, veteran generals, and even foreign envoys were all watching, measuring, and waiting for him to falter. Aristotle had taught Alexander to analyze people as a scholar analyzes biology: observe, recognize patterns, and find rules in behavior. Olympias taught that trust and destiny must be nurtured, not to rely upon, but to fuel action. Philip, meanwhile, taught that power is reinforced by deeds, not promises. These three influences merged, creating an Alexander who was cautious yet decisive, dreamy yet pragmatic. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. When northern tribes rebelled, Philip had to leave Pella for diplomatic negotiations and entrusted Alexander with part of the Macedonian cavalry. This decision shook the court. Alexander was not yet 17, but all the years of physical training, strategic learning, and intellectual growth were now on the line. It was not merely a test of tactics, but a test of pressure endurance, courage, and steadfastness. Alexander fully understood his responsibility. He was not a boy riding horses for practice, but a commander of seasoned warriors who had witnessed countless uprisings and survived many brutal battles. They watched him with skeptical eyes, ready to intervene if danger arose. Alexander, with confidence learned from Aristotle and experience from his father, did not let fear dictate him. He surveyed the terrain, inquired about reconnaissance, studied the enemy formations, and devised a sophisticated ambush plan. Each decision was carefully considered, and each action demonstrated the leadership he had honed over the years. The first encounter with the Urian forces became an important lesson. When the opposing cavalry attempted a surprise attack, Alexander proactively sent his cavalry to flank the enemy. The tactic threw the enemy into confusion, leaving them unable to react. Veteran soldiers following Alexander admitted that his actions were not those of a teenager, but of a commander who understood strategy and, more importantly, could transform knowledge into dynamic strength on the battlefield. Victory came swiftly and decisively, but more significant was how Alexander established his reputation. He stood with his comrades, shared their hardships, feared no dirt, and shunned no pain. His courage was not merely physical strength, but the steadfastness of spirit, a testament to maturity far beyond his years. When Philip returned, he saw that Alexander was no longer a passionate boy, but a true commander who had experienced the cost of power and victory. Admiration mixed with concern appeared in the king's eyes. Philip realized that his son had learned an important lesson. Kingship is not merely a title, but the ability to respond to danger, command the loyalty of soldiers, and determine fate through strategy and decisive action. But Alexander's maturation did not stop on the battlefield. The court remained an equally ruthless arena. Every meeting, every feast, every glance carried hidden messages. He learned to read flattery, detect conspiracies, and distinguish genuine loyalty from political cunning. Aristotle had taught him that intellect must go hand in hand with ethics. Strategy is valuable only when used at the right time and in the right way, and power endures only when a leader respects the laws, trust, and dignity of those who follow him. Olympias, with her faith in destiny and reverence for mythology, continued to instill in Alexander the awareness that he was born for greatness. But she never allowed him to rely on destiny. Belief was fuel, not a rudder. Combined with practical lessons from Philip, Alexander learned to balance ambition with reality, dreams with skill, and destiny with effort. For the first time, Alexander realized that true power did not come from inheritance, but from the ability to prove oneself through action. During these months, Alexander began envisioning future campaigns, especially toward the east, Persia, the vast empire that had dominated Greece for centuries. He studied maps, researched history, and imagined the battles to come. Most Greeks feared, but Alexander saw opportunity. From the court of Pella to the borders of Macedonia, his mind constantly calculated, planned, and prepared for the first steps on the path of conquest. Every decision, every small victory reinforced his confidence, but also awakened the wild side within, the desire for power, the longing for great ambition to turn destiny into reality. By the age of 17, Alexander was no longer Aristotle's pupil, no longer the boy training with soldiers, and no longer Philip's son merely waiting to inherit the throne. He had become a force, a storm on the verge of rising, shaped by knowledge, strength, and mythology, and tested by the harsh realities of life and politics. Every glance, every action, every victory announced that Alexander was ready, not only to inherit the throne, but to shape a new world, ushering in the era of an unprecedented empire.